Ich hoffe, ich werde niemanden enttäuschen, weil ich auf Englisch sprechen werde. So, good morning, and thank you very much for everybody who, thank you, made possible for me to talk today in front of you. Thank you to my colleague whom I know for many years, Professor Ruth Seifert, and the Dean, Irmgard Scholl-Decker. We were working together in Kosovo, and both of them were at the University of Ljubljana at the Faculty of Social Work, where I come from. And my special thanks goes to the students who made this wonderful 2 days. Yesterday, I was with you until 4:30, and then I was told I have to see the Innenstadt. And then I left. So it was really, really very interesting. Okay. Okay, so I think I made it. So I would like to give a little bit of a comparative perspective. I said it, a comparative perspective at glance. What can we think about? It's just really at glance, what can we think about when we think about international social work and social work in a social science discipline. One of the things that, that has happened in the last 10, 15 years is that social work has been internationalized severely. And widespread, and for instance, if I only look at the former Eastern Europe, social work department has been spread around across Eastern European countries, in former Soviet Union, practically, I think except for Tajikistan, I don't know the country in Eastern Europe, there would be no social work. Also, if we look at China and Asia, in China, since 2008, there were more than 300 social work departments have been built, and social work has become really widespread and a kind of taken for granted part of universities. But also, translations have been internationalized, people started to travel, curricula started to travel, ideas and concepts. International social work networks have become really important. And I just want to draw your attention to a few of the networks. The oldest one, International Association of the Schools of Social Work, established by, well, the first president was Alice Salomon in 1928. And then we have a much younger European Association of the Schools of Social Work, and then even younger, since 2008, Eastern European Sub-Regional Association of the Schools of Social Work, and then there are well-known networks like TISA, MATSAS, INDOSO, International Doctoral Studies in Social Work, and the very last that has also very much to do with social work as Wissenschaft, as a social science discipline, is the European Network of Research in Social Work, which was established in 2014. But nevertheless, James Mitglied, a well-known American critical thinker in social work, professor of social work, has emphasized that the relationships within international social work exchanges were not based on reciprocity, but were unilateral, which means that most of the time the Western concepts traveled to the East or to the South, we can already know this if you look at the articles, who is quoting whom, who is using what kind of literature. Most of the time, articles that appear in international journals are quoted Australian, American, or English writers. Even German language is deprivileged partially if I look globally. What about other languages which have much smaller number of people who speak this language? So this is one very minor political action I think we can do, which is that we make sure to see which knowledge is incorporated in our body of knowledge, and can we expand the usual kind of number of our references, and also can we consciously think about which knowledge get reproduced, what do we use when we speak about international social work. Another thing that I think it's really interesting to think about is something that was called by some of the people. We don't know anymore who started the word, the Cold War methodology. Well, you know what the Cold War was in between 45 and 91, but the Cold War methodology meant that actually there was a very stereotypical idea of what is happening within social work, for instance, in Eastern Europe. It was a very homogenizing picture of the East was the same. Well, everything was the same in the East. There were no differences, etc. So let me show you two, I could say, metaphors for me that stands for the Cold War methodology. One is the woman on the tractor. So this was how the West, within the Cold War methodology, perceived Eastern European women. And one of the reasons why there was, for a long time, there was a belief that there was no social work in Eastern Europe was because there was a belief that all of the women actually were working in the building industry, and there were nothing that, and only the institutions were caring for people who needed care. Another symbol is the belief that actually the whole part, this large part of Eastern Europe, didn't have social work education at all, which was not true. And actually, here is my second point, that within the internationalization of social work and seeing social work as social science discipline, most of the countries actually, and especially in Europe, started the search for the historical roots of the profession. And one of the things that we found out, I also did the history of research of social work in Eastern Europe, and especially of former Yugoslavia. First of all, what was found out is that social work is based upon a general definition and a general ethic, what is social work, but it is also very local specific and very contextualized. And we need to see the interplay of both when we contextualize the historical data within the critical research. What we also found out was that there was a long striving for schools and social and a solid scientific foundation from the side of pioneers. So, for instance, one of the pioneers expressed this very clearly. Ilse Arlt, for instance, who established the first school of social work in Vienna in 1912, her books are very clear saying social work has to be science. There is nothing, social work is not just a profession. And this was very, 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 very early on, and it didn't happen like 10 years ago. Another thing that we also found out was that social work pioneers were themselves very international. I mean, it didn't start after 1991 that Western European social work researchers or teachers started to travel to the East. Even Alice Salomon was traveling to Russia, and she knew a lot about revolution, about what's happening there, etc. So it's really interesting to see that there are many, many common issues. And also, the whole homogenization of Eastern European fell apart. There were social work initiatives in 1925 by Helena Radlinska, we know Hungarian social work development by Margit Schlachter, etc. She even got inspired by Jane Addams with the settlement movement. Then she made a settlement Kozma movement in Budapest. Then we know more about Bulgaria and Bulgarian Raina Petkova development in the 20s, also developing social work programs. Then the well-known Princesa Ileana in Romania, she established a school of social work, even an institute, but all of these initiatives were closed down 1945 when the communist leadership came on power, because social work was seen as something from the West, something that it's not needed in social work, but this is another story. The third thing that I would like to mention is the academization of social work. So not only the practice knowledge that is getting produced at the universities, but also we speak about knowledge production within the discipline, so evidence-based knowledge plus evidence production utilization, and some parts of this knowledge production is also critical knowledge. And I really like, and for instance, I just remember many years ago when I met Ruth Seifert, how she was one of the early teachers in social work who was making in Europe really an important international research on comparative research on women and war, social work within the political conflict. These were the issues which were really very new in the 90s. And I like the quote given to me by Mirja Satka, a professor of social work at the University of Helsinki. She said, when I started to work in social work and when I started to become a young teacher in social work, they were told us that we are bureaucrats. But now in the 90s, they ask us to become intellectuals. And another thing so it's actually really the whole idea who is in social work, how to think in social work has been changed over the years. Also jokes are part of the critical thinking and also political thinking. I'm coming from the country where during communist time there were a lot of political jokes and there are a lot of theories how these jokes replaced the active political engagement of people on the ground, and how instead of being part of the wide social movements which are not allowed, people were telling political jokes. So let's look at this joke, which is very old and maybe everybody knows it, but the question is, why do we still laugh at the joke? Do we laugh because of a different reason? So this is the operation hall, and the operator said, "Oh my God, what a big heart." And then another one said, "Her medical record says that she's a social worker." So this is a joke from the 70s. And actually, at that time, the joke was turned upon oneself, saying, okay, we are doing still too much charity, we have to reflect our own thinking and doing, and so. But today, this joke actually stands for the history, for what is not anymore social work. And actually, how social work has been in fact transformed into something else than just having a good heart. And I think historically this is still an interesting picture. But nevertheless, there are some ambivalences and paradoxes. For instance, the development, academization actually of social work means that we have social work on bachelor, master, and doctoral level. And the question is, whose right is this? In the countries with the longest tradition of social work, like Germany, Austria, the Netherlands, social workers still don't have the right to study on the doctoral level. They can go to social pedagogy because, well, social pedagogy and social work is much more intertwined in this kind of, in these countries, but nevertheless you cannot, I mean, it's actually on the other side, in the countries with a much shorter tradition of social work, let's say the countries of former Soviet Union, they all have doctorate in social work. So it's really interesting. And this is, we can see that how the local traditions, I mean, and also political institutions and political structure influences the, even the whole formal possibility to have a doctorate on the, I mean, to study, to develop the, what is called the academization in social work. And another ambivalence is also that, okay, on the one side, we speak about academization in social work. On the other side, we talk about the widening gap between academical endeavor, what is happening at the universities, at the Hochschulen und so weiter, and everyday practice. So we speak about the structural marginalization of social workers, of instrumentalization by the state, of deprofessionalization, which was mentioned yesterday already, about the shrinking of welfare state, about the ambivalences between activation policies versus the end of work, the Jeremy Rifkin's idea of processes, then small jobs, and on the other side, precariousness, social Darwinism, who is entitled and who's not, and so. And here I really like Guy Standing's work on precariat, the new dangerous class. I think you know it all. And his idea of the salariat, the middle class who still has the job but is rather afraid of losing it, and so. So it's actually the question, of course, from the critical perspective, how to bring the academization and everyday life close together, and how to stop this widening gap. Another thing that has been changed also internationally is that social work is more than ever seen as a human rights profession. There are even departments or the program that is called social work as a human rights profession. And within the whole thinking of social work as a human rights profession, there are two things that are addressed. One is the increasing importance of the international documents. So social workers are using to claim the rights for people, to claim the rights for social justice. I see they are extensively using the international documents. Like yesterday we spoke about United Nations Convention of the Rights of the Child and the Genf Convention, and then there are many conventions on women. And the last one, which is really important, and I know that social workers are using it extensively, and social work academics, is how to implement the United Nations Convention of the Rights of People with Disabilities. But this is only part of the story. Another part is how, what is happening on the ground. And here I'm using Jim If, Australian social work academic concept of the human rights from below. So actually how, and understanding social work as a human rights profession means that we support social movements, we support experts with experiences, we invite people who have experiences of being service user to be part of the research, etc. I would like to show you some pictures which I really like, because me, myself, I was involved, I'm still involved in supporting disability people's movement in Slovenia, and how actually, how important it is to conceptualize what to fight for, and how, in fact, critical social work can help people to define what what to fight for, and so. So for instance, this is the picture from 2003 in front of Ljubljana Parliament, how the service, so people on the wheelchairs, in order to fight for the rights, stopped the street. And actually, many of the similar pictures I saw from Germany, from England, and so you can see how there are international, how these issues are international. Or the quote here, this poster says, "We are too young to go to the old people's home," a disability movement protest. And actually, it is still an issue that, because of the lack of community services, people who are younger than 65 or beyond, if they have an accident, if they become a wheelchair user, have to go and live in the old people's home. So it's a structural issue that the civil people movement addressed, but also the issue for social work professionals, because social workers are very often those who say, well, the best and the easiest and the quickest solution is just go to an institution. And they say, well, this will be just a permanent, this will be just a temporary solution, but then it becomes permanent. Here you can see how the playing with the name becomes emancipatory. So yesterday we also heard about the whole issue of the name. So catch the cripple. How I know that in Germany you have the Krüppelbewegung, or you did have it, and so actually it's really interesting how the concepts traveled, and we cannot just find it in one country, in one place. And here again, here this poster says the politicians don't want to know. And this group of people, which was also supported by my School of Social Work, were fighting to have personal assistance instead of going to residential homes and so. So it's actually, and the whole idea is based on the European network of independent living movement, which is again, it's a kind of at least European movement, if not almost international. And there is the newest picture, institution is the worst solution, deinstitutionalization, closure of institutions. And this is a group of Slovenians taking part of a large movement that the so-called the Freedom Drive that takes place in Strasbourg every year in front of the parliament, saying we have to close big institutions all over Europe because they are very often abusive. I will come back to that. And this is very much a social work issue. Okay, so the critical perspective in social work means actually also a very critical perspective in social work research. And for this reason, to give you a little bit of an idea, how can we look at the critical? I didn't want to bother you with the body of knowledge, what kind of qualitative research we have, and how we can move from different mixed methods into the critical practice and so. But I would like to come from the disability studies perspective as a critical thinking. Yesterday, Susanne Maurer actually used the feminist perspective to show the critical thinking. Then another speaker who was looking at the refugees, Professor Karin, she spoke. One can say she was looking from the anti-racist perspective or refugee perspective, and the disability studies has, I would say, very much radicalized social work thinking. Because the social work in many countries, and to some extent still today, was for a long time strongly medically oriented. And if you look at some Asian countries or some Eastern European countries, it still is very much medically, pathologically oriented. And the disability studies, the critical perspective of disability studies actually shows at the structural inequalities, at how the body and mind are socially constructed, how the norm is constructed, how the body is seen, what is seen as normal and what is seen as the deviant, how different cultures deal with so-called deviances, and how yesterday we spoke, the speakers mentioned categorizing people in particular groups, actually, or making so-called scandalous categories. And people with disabilities were for many, many years and still are. I mean, if we look globally, there is very few countries where an extensive change has happened, I mean, including Germany and most of the Western European countries. But if we look globally, I mean, people with disabilities are severely ostracized, excluded, hidden, and seen as a pathology, as etc. So, so here the disability studies actually gives a very good theoretical background to look at the society on structural level as well as one-to-one level, what is happening with the embodied experience, and how actually also the people are not only exposed to the to oppressive environments, but they also fight back. They build a collective. They are showing resilience, etc., and so forth. So there is all sorts of structural and personal and collective that can be actually analyzed through the disability studies. So disability is seen within the disability study as an embodied social and contextual experience. So we cannot eliminate disability, and many disabilities writers say we are all only a temporary non-disabled. So and actually the disability studies, I would say, is really there is very few departments of social work where disability studies are taught. When I was asking people all over the world, do you have disability studies? They answered very usually, oh yes, of course, we have rehabilitation. And I said, this is not disability studies. I mean, I know that rehabilitation is important, but this is not what I mean. So it's really interesting. And very little is known about the life and of people with different impairments in Eastern Europe, and also even less is known about the disability studies. Is there something like a disability study in Eastern Europe? And I was using the work by Michael Russell and Elena Yarskaya-Smirnova. I think this is one of really rare books that looked at the Central and Eastern Europe, and they emphasize that even disability studies, not only disability as embodied experience, cannot be universal because experiences of disability are highly contextual and contingent. And they ask themselves, does disability studies in the West differ from those in the East? And what they found out are the three issues that they looked at, and that where they saw that yes, if we look at the disability studies in the Eastern European countries, they are slightly different or influenced by different circumstances than the disability studies in the West. For instance, the Marxist-oriented critical thinkers in social work in the West were saying that capitalism itself is actually producing disability and is disabling people because the capitalist production needs the able-bodied individuals, etc. What they say is that also state socialism was equally oppressive towards disabled people than capitalism. The whole idea of the normative body that was able to work was very much there as well. Another structural difference is the issue of poverty. The poverty, the bigger poverty in Eastern European countries influenced the whole discourse on disability studies, that for longer time the whole issue of the need-based approach was predominant instead of the rights-based approach, because institutions and large public care institutions gave a promise for people that they will not hunger, they will live in a warm place, someone will care for them, and this was for a long time much more important than the whole issue on rights. And the third thing that they point out is that until the 90s there was an absence of social movements, including disability people movements, which actually very much influenced the disability studies in the West. Because only after 90s the new grassroots organization started with the civil demands for rights. And there is still a kind of a schisma in the whole eastern part of Eastern Europe, that they are very traditional, old-fashioned, so-called invalid organization versus the grassroots organization. And the invalid organization are still very much medically oriented and support the long-term institutionalization, etc. On the top of that, I would like to add two other differences. Two more characteristics of the post-socially Eastern European countries in regarding of understanding disability, but also of disability studies. On a symbolic level, there is the strike about the name still going on. In most Eastern European countries, people with disabilities are still called the invalids. So Nancy Fraser has spoken in the 90s about the importance not only for distributional justice, but also for the right for recognition. And the Invalidus weak and dependent is far away from how United Nations Convention, how we understand today, and we want to understand the issue of disability. And there is still a fight for a name. And the question is why it is so important from a social policy perspective and from the so-called invalid organizations to keep the name invalid. Why does the grassroots organization and also critical writers in social work, why are they haven't succeeded yet to give a more emancipatory, positive, less oppressive name for the person with different impairments? And it probably has to do with the belief that the name was the signifier that actually ensured the people security within the socialist institutions. And removing the name would mean that the whole traditional identity of being a so-called invalid would fall apart, and then we would need to develop something new, and maybe, and there is an insecurity in that. And here we can see that how difficult the changes are in some parts of the world. And on an actual level, there is a delayed institutionalization or a delayed deinstitutionalization that we can see in in most parts of Eastern Europe, and I will show you some pictures about that. So in here now I would like to show you just very briefly a critical analysis of that is part of the disability studies and critical social work, and has to do with the disability, the recognition for the rights of people with disabilities. And one of the things is, as I said before, in Eastern European countries, for social workers, it is mostly taken for granted that they are referring people to large institutions, because this is a kind of immediate solution, which becomes a kind of long-term life for most of the people. So looking at these places, I was doing the critical analysis of the place. And we know from the Foucauldian perspective that the places, the long-stay institutions, are the places of stigma and also contingency, that these are the places where nobody bears the witness for the others. Until recently, there was almost nothing known about what is really happening in these places. There were a lot of silencing of persons who were surveilled within the institutions, who came out, who started to talk. And there was a very disturbed relationship between those inside and those outside. For instance, the relatives didn't want to come and visit the people just because the place was too scary for them. It was also far away. People were not able to travel, etc. The media representation of the institutions in Eastern European countries most often picture institutions as perfect places, with people with the smiling faces, happy doing some occupational work, or getting a new swimming pool, and so it's more about the modernization of the place than the challenging of what is really going on, how the place is actually keeping the same structure and the same unequal and problematic care and disciplining relationship that are going on. And the former communist countries' history of welfare institutions are also the history of old castles, because most of the people were put into the emptied castles which were confiscated by the noble people. So these large boarding schools were outside of the cities, in remote places, in beautiful nature, etc. And as a paradox, the boarding schools and large institutions are at the same time also the workplace for the staff. And this is a kind of creates all sorts of things. Institutions are also the places of violence. We can look at the actual violence, symbolic violence, the micro physics of power, which Susanne Maurer mentioned yesterday, the language of defining the other, the construction of the scandalous groups, of a scandalous category, but also violence is internalized, it is reputational. And I want to show you some of the castles, some of the buildings which were until yesterday almost the places of where people with different impairments were sent. This is the largest place in Slovenia, in the North Slovenia, the largest long-stay institution for adults with long-term mental health problems, but also other disabilities, even civic disabilities, like being long-term unemployed, getting into drinking, becoming stealing some things, etc., and then developing more diagnoses, multiple diagnoses, etc. And in 1948, it was opened, and at that time it was called the Asylum for Mentally Retarded and Youth. Unfortunately, I'm part of the activist groups that that were fighting for closing this place still works and still has 700 people working in it. But you can see this complex. It's really a kind of Foucauldian traditional place of matter out of space, of somewhere else in a beautiful nature, but it is actually institution within has its own rules, has its own economy, etc. This is another castle, also again close to the Austrian border, called Castle Zmurek, and it was closed down in 2004. This was again an asylum for people with different disabilities. I'm very happy to say that today a very interesting group of activists, including social workers, my former social work students, are having the Museum of Madness in this institution. They are having all sorts of activities together with Austrian social work students and so. So here it's also interesting to see cross-country, cross-border activities. This is another castle which was called Slovenian Schönbrunn and was established in 1953 and closed down in 2002. And this was the oldest asylum for children of different disabilities, most of the time intellectual disabilities or mixed impairments, where children from all over the country was sent. I mean, Slovenia is a small country, 2 million population, so, but you can see how, what was the place for, and today, this is a new place, which was, the problem is that the new residential home that has to be, that is supposed to be more open, more accessible, more modern, is, it's still very much in a rural area, which is a problem. It's still connected with the castle, and so, and I can say many things have remained the same. This is the inside, how it looks from inside, and you can see it could be a monastery, it could be whatever, a hospital. I mean, it's yeah. So another question that, so this is an example how we can use the visual representation to do a critical research, and also to show how the place impact the construction of the scandalous category, or the construction of the other, and etc. But there is also people who are in these places. And the question is, whose voice and whose truth is getting reproduced, is getting into the social work textbooks, is getting known, is getting into the media, etc. And I was doing interviews with people who lived as staff and managerial staff, like directors and like people who really have a lot of power in these places, who lived in these castles and are now in new places which are more deinstitutionalized, more open, and so. And I was really struck by some stories, which I will give you today, and then you will see how these institutions also work as workplaces for the staff. One managerial staff, she recalled last year when I was doing my field work, she said, when we moved out, this is from the home for children in 2002, most of the residents left the castle, only a few adults stayed behind. But after this happened, and then she, she pointed to this ceiling. So then she said, when this happened, pointing to the ceiling with a large hole in one of the bathrooms, we definitely decided to move. But we still breathe with the castle. Every day, our residents walk to the sheltered workshops in the building next to the castle. So you can see how there is almost a regret that they have to go out of this place of contingency, and actually it was the physical fear that the ceiling will drop, and not the whole idea of how important it is to go from large spaces to smaller units that actually them, push them out of the place. This is another noble house that was turned into an institution, and was an institution for people with intellectual disabilities until 2007. And within the same research, I was very surprised when I came here and I asked them to open, they opened me the spaces and so, and I got almost the same story. The worker, the psychologist, said, when I came to work on my very first day in 2005, the colleagues in the castle warned me, don't step into this corner. The floor might give up. So in 2007, having worked in the castle for 2 years, we moved to the new place further down the street. So it was again the old place that it became dangerous for the staff and also for the residents that actually make them move out to the, which is very similar than in other places where they had extensive deinstitutionalization, like in the UK, keeping the big buildings were too expensive. But there were also other things that were at place, not only that. So the paradox of the space which is important, is really that this is the home for one. It is seen to be a home for one, which has to be criticized, but the workplace for the other. And you can see how the surrounding of the countryside actually shows the whole idea that people with different disabilities have to be outside of the everyday life, have to be surveilled in a special place, etc. So it's really the countryside where nothing is happening, no infrastructure, and so on. So, but also giving the voice to the silenced is one of the important element of the critical research. So we did a couple of research, we did several interviews with people who today still live in institutions, not of this castle types, except for one, but in different residential homes. And I just want to show to you a couple of quotes that prove that despite the fact that institutions and the staff claims that deinstitutionalization did take place, the everyday life of the residents show that there is very little done about deinstitutionalization. For instance, a man said, I can't choose who to live with. I live in a room with 5 other people. Before there were 4, and that was okay. So still today, many people live in the huge rooms. Another woman, 54 years old, she told us this year, they launder and press our things very nicely. We can bath, we can lock the bathroom if we need help. The nurse scrubs our backs. They give us hygienic pads. They do our fingernails and toenails. I need it because my stomach is in the way. They make sure we are clean, washed, and safe. And if somebody gets lost, they go and find them. So again, a very, very traditional, everyday life of big residential institutions. and she lives here for 26 years. And most of the people work in sheltered workplaces. These are the workplaces where people get an award, not a salary, and they do very simple work, and they actually cannot, actually, these sheltered workshops don't give them the space for actually community living. We get up in the morning, have breakfast, mount the bus to sheltered workshop, and then back from work to dwelling unit. Then we eat, and then tidy up. So actually it is the sheltered workplace and then the small units where some people live, but it's not actually really the everyday community living. And another person, the woman, 52 years old, in the morning I'm at the sheltered workshop. In the afternoon I come home. Sometimes I iron the laundry, sometimes I go for a walk and I listen to music, and time passes fast. When you are ill, you can stay at home, which means in the community, in the group home. Otherwise, you can't. Again, the isolation being matter out of place in the Foucauldian terms, to paraphrase him, is actually very, very typical. Nobody comes to see me. My mother and father were coming until they died. Not every day, but just every now and then. Or I have aunts who come visit when they have time, during summer. So again, the more isolated the place, the more far away the place, the more chances there are that people don't get visits of relatives and so. And here this quote stands for that most of the time the residents socialize with the staff and not with the people outside. Sonia, the psychologist, takes time for us. She comes here every morning and we talk a little. She looks around it if everything is okay, the refrigerator and such. Yes, she comes here in the morning before the two of us go to work. They are in a couple, they live in a couple in a group home. We like this very much. If not for that, we would have been alone. So actually, even people who live in smaller residential units up to 24 persons or between 4 and 6 are very much isolated. The place, the stigmatized place is not the stigma only for the residents, but also for the staff. The staff within institutions told me incredible stories where, again, they showed how important it was for them to change the place and not to have in mind, in focus, the residents. One of the women told me, she said it was the smell that was horrible. And she said, and the smell was from medication, and the doors and the windows were closed, and the hygiene was maybe not so well, although the hygiene was rather good in comparison with other things. So she said, it stank so bad, our workers went home, and their husbands kept asking them, what is going on at your workplace that you stink so badly when you come home? Afterwards, it was much better. So it means like in the last 15 years. We took care after the hygiene. The staff was changing sheets of persons who urinated in bed. We got better diapers. We were airing regularly and so on. So actually, the whole symbolism of the air was actually, I would expect, the kind of the story of the fresh air coming to the institution, the new ways of thinking and doing, but it was more about making a better place, working place for the staff. And there is another story that actually struck me very much, and I saw how big is the difference between the understanding of the staff, very often social workers also, and the residents. We also had 2 persons with encephalitis, so interesting that they still use this word. The water heads. They had huge heads, and sometimes it happened that both of the persons looked out the window before we mounted the double protection, and the people saw them, and so the double protection, let me show you what she meant. So this is a kind of, this is the window, and this is a double protection which was used until 2002. They closed this, so the residents were not able to line out, because the problem was that the local people saw them and they were horrified. Such people live in the castle. Then people thought that all of them looked like this too. We quickly moved them away from the window. So it was again like trying to keep the place less stigmatizing for the staff. Okay, so memory work is part of the critical social work research. So what I did here is I looked at the forms of violence, also how the memory was silenced, how people remember, and I really liked the idea of Jeffrey Hartman, who said that maybe the cultures could be differentiated from each other from the level of their memory tolerance. We know that the democratization of everyday life goes through the memory diversity, and the societies and the places and people who are keeping one memory as the dominant memory and are not able to see the diverse memory voices it's really important to look at this in social work, how to expand the democratization of everyday life through the memory diversity, and how we can do this in critical research. I will skip this. I want to show you a few more pictures just to see what do I mean when I say that we need to look at the many welfare institutions as the places of violence, and that this is a part of what the critical research could be. I found in one of the castles that are closed already, I found this isolation room. I found few isolation rooms. I'm aware that almost all over the world, in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, when I was traveling and doing research, I found isolation rooms. They were pretty much the same, only the colors were different. In Taiwan, most of the isolation rooms are pinky. So this was the artificial ladder. This is the door. This is the window that the staff looks in what's going on. But this is the window within the isolation room that can go close, so the person lives there in a complete sensory deprivation, which is really a form of oppression. And here was another one. I mean, it's old because the castle has been closed since 2002, but what really struck me, it was another color and this wheelchair. This wheelchair is obviously for children, so this was within the children institution. That was for the legs, so obviously when they brought the children into his isolation room, probably the child was also tied in the wheelchair. So this is a very common form of violence that is still in use in most part of the world, and most of the staff will never show it to you. I mean, what I was doing was I just asked, can you show me isolation rooms? But if I would not ask this, nobody would show me.
I just have a question. What was it used for? Is it for punishment? Or?
Yes, it was for if someone acted out, if someone was violent, this is very arbitrary. I mean, when is it used? I mean, there are some research that show within UK, Australian, and American context that most of the time the isolation rooms are are used on Friday afternoon and during the weekends when there is little staff, when there is young staff, and the least experienced staff, etc. So it's, and then I found another way of punishing. This is within a room where there are more beds, but this was a kind of a cage where here was a bed, and when the person, the young person, was too violent or whatever, I mean, she or he was put into this cage like a semi-isolated place. For instance, here you can see it's not entirely isolated because here was another bed. So this building is also empty. And this was a very typical panopticon. In the middle of the corridor, there was a small little room where the staff could observe and watch and surveil, in Foucauldian terms, all parts of the ward that during the night, but at the same time they could lock themselves in, etc. So this is privacy deprivation, very typical in large institutions. And this is I found in the children's castle. Again, another type of taken for granted violence, or doors with this surveillance window, which is also very, very typical. And actually, there is everyday violence, which is still at place. My German Berlin students at the MA level told me last week about many, many cases. But I just want to show you this one, which is just recent, and it really struck me. It's from Ljubljana. The man who is using a wheelchair and lives in a boarding school, and he says it wasn't all that hard in the institution from the beginning, but in the last years many things got complicated. This happened 2 days ago. It was at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, just after lunch. The nurses said I should take a bath between 3:30 and 4 afternoon, and then go to sleep. So I told them, well, got me to bed now, so you needn't work on me anymore. I was angry. The personnel quarrels among themselves who will do what during their shifts. So it's really today. And this is something that we cannot see. It has nothing to do with physical punishment. It has nothing to do with isolation rooms. But it is about everyday, institutional violence that is taking place, I would say, all over the space. And we have exceptional places, but not so very many. So I will skip this, and I just want to say that, therefore, I think from the critical perspective, one of the concepts that I find extremely important is the issue of deinstitutionalization. The concept itself means that it stands for moving people out of long-stay institutions into the community, and the development of sufficient welfare programs and services for those who need them, either on a daily basis or short-term or indefinitely. For instance, the personal assistant on the 24 shift and so on. And because of the austerity measures, I was told that in the Netherlands, people are staying without the personal assistance at the moment, and the things are really getting bad. So it's really one of the things that even in the countries that have personal assistance can go backwards, not forwards. And again, from everyday stories, we can move to the international documents like United Nations Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, that says in the Article 19 that living independently is the right, and being included in the community. Not just living in the community, but being including in the community. Only Belarus, as far as I know, haven't signed the United Nations Convention out of other Eastern European countries. So, but there are many fears. What is the institutionalization? Because there is a fear for a workspace. And it's really the question, what does it mean? Why is this such a difficult concept that so many professionals, including social workers, are so hesitant? One of the social workers told me just recently, she said, deinstitutionalization is a scarecrow. People fear for the jobs and everybody understands it differently. Some think we will bring down the walls around the institution. Some think it's losing the scraps, so the institutional clothes. Others again think it means that the users partake in sporting activities. So it's really banalization of the whole notion of the institutionalization. And despite the fact that most of the Eastern European countries committed themselves toward deinstitutionalization, there is on the social policy level, it's very, very little that has happened, especially especially in the countries, within the EU countries. So this was one of the examples where I wanted to show you how to use the critical social work knowledge within research and thinking and conceptualizing, and the production of knowledge that we are actually producing here can make a difference and can bring about the social change. And one of the special thing I think is a comparative critical research. There are not really many critical comparative research knowledge production within international context of social work. So I'm sure that even also this conference, I hope it will contribute towards more critical social work research and more comparative international social work research. So here I just gave you some of the references where you can get some of the work that I've done, and thank you very much, and I'm open for questions, discussions, comments.